Good morning and welcome to the Keen webinar series. I'm Steve Hasbrook of the Kern Family Foundation. Today's webinar is entitled The Curiosity Index, Measuring and Improving Students' Curiosity. And our presenter today will be Julia Williams. A couple of housekeeping items to start with. During today's webinar, please use your control panel's question entry box to ask questions. I'll be monitoring the questions to ask Julia, and she will leave time at the end of her presentation to answer them. Also, during the webinar, please share any valuable insights that you gleaned from Julia's presentation via Twitter and include our address @KeenUnleashed. This webinar and Julia's slides will be posted on the Keen website at keennetwork.org for replay and reference by the end of this week. First, a brief word about curiosity. We're excited to bring you this webinar highlighting a key component of the entrepreneurial mindset, which is curiosity. Together with connections and creating value, curiosity about our changing world is perhaps the most critical element of the entrepreneurial mindset that the Keen schools work to instill in undergraduate engineers. As Mr. Kern likes to point out, without curiosity, you will walk right by opportunities to create value. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Julia Williams is Executive Director of the Office of Institutional Research, Planning, and Assessment, and also Professor of English at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. Her research areas include technical communication, assessment, accreditation, and the development of change management strategies for faculty and for staff. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Engineering Education, International Journal of Engineering Education, IEEE Transaction on Professional Communication, and Technical Communication Quarterly, amongst others. This past January, Julia presented on her work in assessment and development of curiosity at the Keen Winter Conference in Tempe, Arizona. Her breakout session was incredibly well received and received high praise from everybody in attendance. Today, Julia will introduce a curiosity index, a survey tool used at Rose-Hulman to gather baseline data on the curiosity of both freshmen as well as seniors. In addition, Julia will focus on how other schools can participate in the development of an archive of curiosity data. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Julia Williams. Julia?
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate the introduction, and I also appreciate this opportunity to talk more about the Curiosity Index, to share some of the things we're doing at Rose-Hulman, and to, at the end, describe some next steps that we think could help with the partnership amongst Keen schools. Right now I'm going to turn off my webcam. I think that's a little distracting for me as a presenter, but you'll be able to see my slides. I'll be referring to the slides as well as some resources that are on the webinar page that Elena set up, so I'll be referring to those as well. And as Steve said, why don't you go ahead, if you have questions, fire those off to Steve. He'll keep track of those, and I'll be able to address those as we go along. Great. So as Steve suggested, or Steve indicated, I was at the Keen Winter meeting, and I was thrilled to be able to present some information about the use of a survey instrument tool we are using called the Curiosity Index. And you know, as all of us in the Keen Network are grappling with, we know that curiosity is a key piece of the entrepreneurial mindset. And for an assessment person like me, the question really is, well, is this something that we can measure in students, and can we have some kind of intervention that will improve their curiosity? Can we also see an increase in curiosity after those interventions from freshman year to senior year? So I'm going to cover all of that. And I want to start actually maybe in a weird place. I want to take a long historical perspective on curiosity and go all the way back to the 18th century and talk about the British philosopher, politician, and a general Renaissance man, Edmund Burke. Burke in the 18th century was very interested in the question of what is curiosity and how or what role does it play in the human mind. And I found two quotes in particular from his treatise called On the Sublime and the Beautiful, two quotes from that treatise that I thought were particularly relevant to our own investigation of curiosity. If you read through this first bit of the treatise, you'll see that he identifies curiosity as the simplest emotion that we can discover in the human mind. And he also takes, I think, a very negative view about what curiosity is when he says curiosity is the most superficial of all the affections. It changes its object perpetually. It has an appetite which is very sharp but very easily satisfied. And it always has the appearance of giddiness, restlessness, and anxiety. Now for Burke, he uses a very powerful metaphor about curiosity. Namely, he talks about children and how they run quickly from new thing to new thing to new thing, never satisfied, but always restless, and he characterizes that as anxious. And I suppose when any 18th century philosopher compares quality of the human mind to something related to childhood, that's probably not a positive characterization. Now, in addition to this rather negative version of curiosity that Burke provides, I was also interested in really a contrary view of curiosity, and something I see as much closer to how we are using curiosity in EML and in the Keen network. Curiosity from its nature is a very active principle, so that part, I think, is part of what we are looking at curiosity and how we are envisioning it. And the fact that curiosity, Burke says, is one of the materials in every instrument which works upon the mind. In a way, he's saying curiosity is the founding motivator. It blends itself more or less with all our passions. So everything that we're interested in, everything that we do, and how we think, curiosity is blended in there to some degree, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but it's always there. So I'm going to call curiosity in Burke's framework as a first principle. And if we look at our, key materials, that's exactly how curiosity is being framed there as well. Curiosity is the first quality of the entrepreneurial mindset, right? That it's listed first in the list of 3 C's. So I think that indicates its role as a founding principle. And it also is that foundation for which all the other things that are going to happen in EML actually start. And that further definition that we find later on in the same document about curiosity demonstrate constant curiosity about our changing world helps you explore a contrarian view of accepted solutions. I think Burke would look at those definitions and say, absolutely, contrarian view, yes, challenging things. Curiosity, always about the world around us and how we encounter that world. Now, from Burke to Keen, I want to shift the framework of our discussion just slightly to talk about curiosity in more contemporary analyses that are happening in psychology and in assessment. Specifically, we need to start, if we're going to assess curiosity, if we want to say, here's where our students are, here's what they achieve, we need to define what curiosity is. And there are quite a few definitions for curiosity in the literature. I made a reference list that allows you to look through some of the other resources that are part of the curiosity discussion going on in literature and references. Now, we picked out this particular information gap theory of curiosity out of a pretty long list of potential definitions. Now, our reason for doing that was really prompted not so much by our work with Keen, but by our work with 2 different groups on campus. We were first asked to look at curiosity by faculty who were in the computer science and software engineering department. They were the ones who said, we're really interested in knowing if our students are curious about the projects that they work on, and are they exploring all the dimensions of a project as they work on it. That was an interesting question for us because obviously when you think about computer science and software engineering, that could be a very creative, a very self-motivated sort of discipline to be in, and so we thought, well, we could probably do some research in curiosity, see if there's a way to link curiosity to the performance of this computer science or software engineering student in their design work, etc. The other place, though, that we saw curiosity creating or generating interest was in enrollment management. The enrollment management office on our campus, which is collecting, thousands of applicants from high school seniors. And at Rose-Hulman, you might not be surprised to learn that we get a lot of applications from very accomplished, high-performing students. And in a way, that makes it difficult to decide who will be admitted and what particular qualities in their background would indicate their potential for success at Rose-Hulman. So, for example, if you have 10 students who were all 4.0 grade averages in high school and were all valedictorians and all have a raft of extracurricular activities, what can you look at as a defining and distinguishing mark that will help decide, okay, this student we should admit because this student has the potential to be successful at Rose-Hulman. And here's how we're going to decide. So I put these frameworks onto our definition of curiosity because as we talk more about the information gap theory, this really does speak to those two needs we had on campus, both in CSSE, computer science and software engineering, and in enrollment management. So the information gap theory, I think, it spoke to me, and I hope it speaks to you as well, that curiosity arises when an individual notices a gap in his or her knowledge and then is motivated to gain more knowledge to reduce that gap. Now, the importance of this definition is, yes, it takes that individual recognizing the gap and the motivation to fill that gap in some way. And I think that's really important because this shows that a lot of what's happening for the individual is inside, okay? And this is why Lowenstein sort of identifies this as curiosity as an emotional, motivational state driving exploration and learning, meaning that we are looking at curiosity as something that is part of the individual's makeup and drives them forward. That's the thing that makes them investigate and look carefully at the world around them. Now, if we're going to take this definition from Lowenstein and say, oh yes, information gap, it's an emotional, motivational state, then what we're really talking about in terms of assessment is not our customary focus on behavior. I'm an assessment person, and if I'm going to assess students' accomplishments in, say, communication, for example, I'm going to ask, or I'm going to try to observe students in, for instance, an oral presentation. And I'll be able to look at their performance in that setting, and I'll use that to determine if they are successful as, if they are a successful communicator. For instance, if we are talking about the situation of an oral report, I can look at the student who is delivering the oral report and I can note their professional appearance, whether they've worn the appropriate attire. I'll also be able to listen to their tone of voice. I'll be able to know if they have organized their content well, if they're able to reach out to the audience and speak persuasively. These are all behaviors. I am able to observe their performance, and I can use that then as the basis for a measurement of their oral communication skills. But curiosity inhabits a very different area within assessment, because what we're looking at is really a disposition rather than a behavior. And for that, we looked at Carr and Claxton. Assessing a disposition is somewhat different. A disposition really is a tendency to edit, select, adapt, and respond to an environment in a recurrent, characteristic way. So if I have a disposition regarding curiosity, I'm going to be able to, adapt, respond to my environment in a characteristic way. So that, again, speaks to why behavior is different from disposition and why assessing a disposition requires a different kind of instrument. For that, we looked across the literature and the different kinds of assessments that were out there, but we settled on Keston-Fulcher's Curiosity Index, and I have linked up to, or Elena's linked up to the website some of these basic resources. In particular, Fulcher's most complete statement about the Curiosity Index appeared in an article he wrote for Assessment Update. And this article actually describes the development of the index not for the purpose of EML, of course, but for his own work in trying to assess lifelong learning in students. If you think about lifelong learning, again, if we're assessing that as a behavior, then we might look at things like, well, did the student go out and pursue additional certifications? Did the student go out and get an MBA? These would be behaviors that I could remark and measure. But I think you would agree, I hope you would agree, that you could go out and get an MBA and still not have that disposition toward lifelong learning. So the Curiosity Index was Fulcher's way of trying to get his arms around something like lifelong learning and the disposition to lifelong learning. So the Curiosity Index is a short self-report measure, short 16 items on the survey. And these items are going to assess an individual's curiosity through depth, meaning the individual wants to explore and understand new objects, events, and ideas. It will investigate the individual's curiosity via breadth, seeking varied or changing experiences. And then it will also give a score for total curiosity. Now, the interesting thing about this particular way of assessing curiosity is that this index, the Curiosity Index, has got 16 items. Some of them are mapped to depth, some of them are mapped to breadth, but not all 16 are mapped to either one. So when I show you some of these data tables a little later on, you'll be able to see that the depth score is mapped to particular items, breadth to other items, but the total curiosity score will not be the sum of the depth and the breadth scores, just so you know. I just want to make that clear. So what does this Curiosity Index look like? Well, here's a sample of these items that are part of the survey. As I said, this is a self-report measure, so we send these out to students and we ask them to respond on a 6-point Likert scale, so it's everything from strongly agree to strongly disagree. These are all statements rather than questions, and there is no neutral in the middle, so it's a forced choice. They have to either agree or disagree, and the scale of to what degree they agree or disagree is going to be up to them. Now, I think a quick review of these questions would probably give you some indication about which ones are going toward breadth and which ones are going toward depth. A student who says, I seldom research a topic in great depth, probably is not demonstrating a disposition toward curiosity in terms of the depth scale. That doesn't mean the student is not curious, but that their strength in or their disposition and curiosity may not be toward depth, it may be toward breadth. So the question, I like variety in my life, does speak to that breadth issue, and a student might have both or may register strongly for one or the other. All right? So what happens after we distribute this this assessment instrument to our students? Let me talk about this in terms of some brief data tables that give you a picture of where we are currently with using the Curiosity Index. So, as I said before, we started working on this project at the request of the Computer Science and Software Engineering Department as well as our Enrollment Management Department. And our idea was initially, let's see if this particular feature in a student's, or this disposition toward curiosity, if that can help us differentiate between these prospective students, all high achievers with the same credentials. Could this be a way to help us distinguish one from another and make some choices in that regard? Now, we've done this now for 3 years, and it's done, the assessment instrument is being directed at the freshmen. I know, Steve, we talked about the seniors, but we haven't quite reached that point of surveying the seniors quite yet. The idea, though, is every incoming student is given an invitation to participate in the survey. And you see those N's across the top, 503, 484, 553. That's the that's the N for incoming freshmen who take the survey, not for the entire freshman class. As I said, all students are invited to take it, but not all of them do. We do try very hard, though, to get as many of them as we can into the survey. The total curiosity number across the top is the average of all 16 items that is on the survey. And you notice that if you added your breadth and depth scores for 2012, that would not add up to 66.83. But the idea is that some of those items are mapped to breadth, some to depth, but not all of them are mapped to either one. Okay. Now, the comparison, though, is this general college freshman sample on the right. At this point, this is the only comparison group that we have, because this is the comparison group that Keston Fulcher has been able to gather up at James Madison University, where he is a professor in the psychology department. The idea is that James Madison University, their freshmen take the identical survey instrument, and this is where their students are compared to our freshmen 2012, 2013, and 2014. All right? Now, if you're noticing some big differences here, you should be looking at the total curiosity number year to year compared to the general college freshman sample and the depth comparison. All right? I'm pointing these two out because in terms of breadth, the Rose-Hulman freshmen, and remember that Rose-Hulman freshmen, all of our students are STEM majors, they don't really have a significant, or they don't really have a distinct difference from their peers at James Madison University, right? But where we do see a difference is in total curiosity and in depth. So we've been working on some hypotheses regarding the data as we see it, not just this table, but a couple of others. And in this particular version of the data, we're working around an idea that this general college sample that we're comparing our students to is perhaps not the best comparison group that we could come up with. Essentially, you know, we are comparing Rose-Hulman freshmen, these STEM majors, and we are predominantly a male student population. Our women's student population is running about 22%. But if we compare ourselves to James Madison, where they also have STEM majors, but they also have English majors and, you know, English majors and language majors, I mean, that's not a very, probably an accurate comparison group for us. I think what we can say at this point, though, is that our students are coming in more curious than our comparison group. And that's interesting for us because that means that we are attracting students who are already disposed to be curious. Now, of course, because we are in a STEM institution, and I said our female population is running about 22%, we also need to ask a question about whether the curiosity data that we're gathering is, if we can differentiate it by gender. And so that's what the next table is really about. Taking all of that freshman data from 2012, 2013, and 2014, and then compiling it male to female. So we took all freshmen those 3 years, all the male freshmen, put them in one column, all the female freshmen for those 3 years in the other column, and then see how their numbers compare there. Now, the interesting part here is that in terms of total curiosity, that may not be the biggest difference that we see. It's the breadth and depth numbers that become more and more interesting as we go down the list. In terms of total curiosity, we see, and we're using that p-value 95%. We're 95% confident that this relationship is there. But as we go down the list, we become more and more confident that women students are disposed, in terms of the type of curiosity that they're exhibiting, they're disposed to breadth. Lots of different subjects, and then the male students are more disposed to depth. Okay? Now, all three of these are significant, as I said, but it's the female-male comparison on breadth and depth that's really interesting us, right? And we ask ourselves questions about this information as well. In the previous table, we noticed that more of our students were that entire freshman class exhibited more depth than breadth. But that could be really a result of the fact that we have such a high male student population. If we, for instance, could bring our female numbers up to 50-50, then we would expect that the breadth and depth numbers would change for the entire freshman class. It's also the case that because there are more men in STEM fields than women, this also has an impact on our numbers. So the other question to ask ourselves is, okay, we've got this data. It suggests that women are disposed in their curiosity to focus on breadth. We can ask ourselves, what are we doing in the curriculum and the co-curricular experiences that would help us attract and retain women students? And one of the ways to do that, I would think, just based on this data, is make sure that you are serving their needs in terms of breadth. Now, as I said before, our comparison group in the previous table was the James Madison freshman sample. And the question that we've asked ourselves here is, what would our comparison data look like if we had more Keene schools that would run the Curiosity Index and Keene schools that have both liberal arts and engineering? Would we see the same distinctions if we could compare ourselves to Keene schools that were a little more like us than James Madison is, but still have that liberal arts component? So I think that every time we add data to our pool, we're going to be increasing that confidence, and that's great. That really does make us think that this is a worthwhile path to take. So when I was at the Keene meeting, one of the interesting outcomes of that discussion about the Curiosity Index was looking at the depth of curiosity by major. And what we did here is that we took only the depth results, because depth was the only item that had a significant difference between majors. So there was no point in really trying to divide majors up by the total curiosity or by breadth. It was the depth of curiosity that was the significant difference. Now, one of the things I thought was really interesting at the Keene winter meeting was how this data played in the with the attendees who were there. Now, just to clarify, this is all 3 years of freshman data divided out by majors, and if you don't recognize some of our acronyms, that long line in the middle are the software engineering majors. Okay? Their depth of curiosity was the highest of all majors, with computer engineering, CPE, coming in second. Now, the funny moment in the winter webinar was when someone asked me, well, who are those slackers at the bottom of the depth scale? And that was a very interesting read of what this data is showing us, because the two that are least performing in depth are CE, civil engineering, and BE, biomedical engineering. And I would bet everyone in this audience could probably assume that that's where we have a much higher number of women students in those two majors. So it's hard for us to really know if the fact that SE is so high in depth is really a result of the fact that we have very few women who are majoring in software engineering. We can't be sure if that's what's causing the difference, or if it's just a different tendency within software engineers. And we can't tell if this is the major field. You know, you're attracted to a field because of your gender, because of the type of work that's being done. Some of it is maybe more, more relevant to breadth than to depth. These are questions that we're still working on here. So it's not that one of the majors is a slack major. It's that it appeals to, or the students who are engaged with it are exhibiting a different disposition toward curiosity, a different kind. Okay, finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about this data table, because this one I think has got some relevance across our network, even if you're not running the Curiosity Index yet. One of the things that we also were running in tandem with the Curiosity Index was John Carpenter's EML, Entrepreneurially Minded Learning assessment that he's been running out of Lawrence Tech. And we have been running that survey instrument for not as long as the Curiosity Index. But we did think it would be interesting if we could find a correlation, perhaps, between the items that are on Dawn's survey and the items that are on the Curiosity Index. And we are seeing correlations here, and they're all significant. I'm talking about everything that's in the problem-solving, critical thinking area. It's moderate correlation, but it is important for us to make note of. So if we put curiosity and problem-solving, critical thinking, and we relate those two together, then this gives us a path forward to talk about what are we going to do to increase students' curiosity, encourage curiosity, and the place to look for interventions in the curriculum or the co-curricular programs would be in problem solving and critical thinking. And let me just say this a different way. As we look at problem solving and critical thinking going up, we see a related increase in the curiosity side. Okay, so increased depth increases problem solving and critical thinking. Increased problem solving and critical thinking increases depth. That's really important news because that means we've got an actual place to make an intervention and make it in an intentional and considered way. How do we raise curiosity amongst our students? Well, I think the intervention is to increase problem solving and critical thinking activities. And that's an actionable thing for us to do. As we're looking at curricular change amongst, looking at courses within the key network schools, that's a place to look. So this gives you an idea of the basic outline of the data that we've collected so far, the initial work that we're doing with it, the questions that we're asking about the data. And this is my what next slide. We think that this information is persuasive enough and is interesting enough to create a curiosity index database across the network. And so what this slide relates to is my invitation for you to participate with us to create a database of curiosity index across our member schools. And this is how we're proposing going about this. First, we'd like to share the curiosity index with you so you can set that up on your own servers, distribute it to your own students. We'd start with freshmen and have that covered by your own IRB. Once you've been able to run that, and you saw from my data that we're running this in the fall, so the freshmen arrive on campus, and one of the first things that they will do when they're on campus is complete the curiosity index. At that point, we'll have a very good baseline starting point for what they come to Rose-Hulman or what they come to your school with in terms of their disposition in curiosity. Now, from there, we'd like to have you send your data file to Rose-Hulman so we can add this to the database. We are not going to be identifying individuals within this data file, but you can keep that information for yourself. But at that point, we'll start compiling the data and make it accessible to you for your use. I think it would be a great thing if we don't try to identify, compare how Rose-Hulman is doing compared to Lawrence Tech and ONU. We wouldn't want to do it that way. I think we should be able to see your school and comparison with the aggregate from all the other schools. So you'd be able to identify where you're performing, where your freshmen are performing against the entire network, which could be very interesting for you. And then at that point, we could do some follow-up webinars so we can discuss the results and see if there are more uses that we can make of this data. So those are my basic slides right there. And I wanted to open things up to everyone to talk more about what we've got here. And Steve, I can throw it back over to you if you've got questions you want me to deal with.
Great, thanks, Julia. That was fantastic. You've really given us all a lot to think about, and you pointed out some fantastic opportunities for us to work together with more institutions to both measure and develop a curiosity in our students. So
Great.
Thank you very much for that inspiring presentation. I do have a question to start out, but before I ask that, I just want to encourage everyone on the webinar, if you do have a question, please use your question box in your control panel, and you can get that into us, and we'll answer as many as we can with the time allotted here and the time remaining. So please send those in. The first one is actually from our own Dr. Doug Melton, Keene Program Director, and he mentioned the book Curious by Ian Leslie, which we actually recommended as part of our recommended reading at the Winter Conference this year. He said the author talks about different types of curiosity, the two types of dispositional curiosities being diversive and epistemic. And he mentions that diversive is that type that leads to many interests, and as I think about your presentation, I think about that breadth that you were talking about. And then the epistemic is that more deep curiosity. It drives individuals to really investigate a topic. And so Doug's question was, does the index attempt to measure these two types independently, or is that what, as you were talking about the breadth and the depth analysis, is that really what that is referring to?
Right. So I translated, when I read Leslie's book, I linked up diversive to breadth. I linked up epistemic to depth. And maybe the thing that Leslie doesn't have in his book is that kind of total curiosity to measure the disposition more holistically. But I do think that they're relevant, and I think it's nice to be able to break them out, depth and breadth, because these are going to be different ways of exhibiting your curiosity for different kinds of students. Obviously, the male-female, the gender difference is an important one for us and STEM to really contend with. Does that answer your question? Or
yeah.
Does that answer Doug's question?
Well, we'll have to find out. It answered it well for me. Thank you very much. So here's another question. We're getting questions that are rolling in, and this is great. I encourage people to keep sending these in, and I'll just address them as we go here. The first one says, what is the benefit of comparing curiosity indexes across schools and majors? Do we want to see how EML impacts students longitudinally?
Yeah. So I think that we can't be confident in the questions we're asking about our freshman class compared to the general college freshman sample, because that sample seems to not be quite comparative to our students. So I think that the advantage is to be able to compare your own institution to schools like you who are also engaged in working on EML to see if we can make some differences that are impactful. So that's really why I think the comparison is useful. I don't know if the questioner is reluctant to have that data out in the world, but of course, if we're handling your data, we're going to handle it with the security and data management practices that we always use within the Office of Institutional Research Planning and Assessment, which is where I serve as Executive Director.
Great. Thank you. The next one actually was just an observation about the James Madison data. It seemed like the depth and the breadth scores actually added up and equaled the total curiosity value, and not sure if that was just coincidence, but they were asking if there was a difference in the way that James Madison was collecting their data versus the data collected by Rose.
Yeah, not to my knowledge, but you pointed out something that I really should look at further, because you're right, your math was good, whoever that was, congratulations. You get a check plus for that. I just know we are using it, identically to what's in the assessment update article, but I will check that to be sure. Okay. Sure.
And the next question, Julia, is asking about Rose and how you're looking at the curiosity index. And have you or do you plan to do a longitudinal study on your own students to see if their curiosity index is actually changing over the years?
Absolutely. So we've got the 3 years of freshman data. Those 2012 freshmen are going to be coming up to their senior year here somewhat soon, seems. I'd like to do the seniors one time without them having had the freshmen, just to give that kind of baseline for seniors. And then the next year, you know, deal with the freshmen, the freshmen now seniors who took the index during freshman year. Also, I think it's important as we are getting more and more of our Keen courses online, our EML courses online, I'd be very interested to see if there is some measurable difference from freshmen who went through these Keen courses. We can, you know, put them up against each other. Let's look at freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, you know, or freshmen and seniors, those who have been in EML courses, those who have not, to make those comparisons as well. When we start doing those comparisons, it's not just, you know, how freshmen are doing, seniors are doing, how are they doing in comparison to other members of the population who aren't getting EML courses. And I think by showing, you know, the impact that the courses are making, then we've got a very good argument to put before the rest of the faculty to say, look, here's how EML is making a difference in our students, in their curiosity, problem solving. That's very persuasive when you're trying to convince other faculty that this is a really good way to go.
Great. Next question, Julia, is about the data. Was the data used to create the correlation coefficients based on a single EML type project or a more broad survey?
It was much broader. It was much broader. I mean, right now we're just getting stuff going, so we're trying to take our data pool where we can. So we have done the EML survey for all freshmen, just as we did for the Curiosity Index, all freshmen. Our first EML courses just came online this past year in winter and spring, and then we're doing a big ramp-up of EML course development in early June and through the summer. So at this point, yes, we are casting a very broad net, but I think as we go on, we'll be able to, you know, parse out the EML versus the general curriculum, and that's when we can start seeing some differences, I hope.
Great. Here's a more keen focus type question, and as you know, as we define curiosity as a collective network, it's a little bit nuanced. You know, when we describe curiosity, we always talk about curiosity about our changing world. Our benefactor, Mr. Kern, is very passionate about that the need to be curious, not just about a topic or a specific technology, for instance, but really about what's going on around us, and to have our students have that appreciation how drastically and how speedily things are changing around us in our changing world. So does the index get at that at all?
The index in its current formulation does not get at this question. If we can identify a student's disposition about curiosity toward our changing world. But I don't think it's much of a stretch to see the possible direction for an additional question or two on the instrument that we could add, as long as we validate those questions. And also looking at that particular kind of curiosity within the context of a particular class. If a professor is developing curriculum that is targeting you know, that broader view or that view about our changing world, then I think there's a place to measure that. So at this point, no, but I think this has very good sort of potential for moving us down the path to getting right where we want to be on that particular question.
Julia, when we had the chance to touch base after your presentation at the winter conference, and actually started thinking about this concept of doing the webinar, I'm just delighted that you were able to do this for us. We talked about the opportunity to involve other institutions and how that would actually be of benefit to you and your work. Could you take a minute to describe exactly kind of what you would be looking for in terms of the institution and potentially the faculty that you would like to work with in terms of partnering in this effort?
Sure. As I indicated at the end with that kind of what's next slide, we are interested in developing partnerships with individuals and institutions that believe that this could help them as well. Obviously, you know, Rose-Hulman would benefit from having this data, but I believe in sharing the data back with other schools as well, so they could use it for their own decision making, what kind of interventions, how to evaluate EML activities on campus. At this point, I would perhaps see the starting point as, someone who's working on EML on their campus has got a student population that they could work with and convince to do a survey, which sometimes is hard to do with students, I know. But if we had that kind of like-minded group to start with, and even if the population on your own campus is small, that's a starting point. We start with that, and then we can build out as far as we can. Obviously, in some places, you're not going to have a lot of luck convincing, say, the, I don't know, French literature department to run a survey like this. But on the other hand, you may see some, and you might be able to persuade them using some skillful persuasion techniques, that this would be of interest to them too. So I'm happy to start small, to test it out as a pilot, and then see where we go from there.
Great. Here's another question that came in from our Keene faculty. It says that problem solving and critical thinking have been traditionally part of design teaching in engineering. And how do we separate the effect of entrepreneurial-minded learning from the normal practice of design teaching when talking about engineering curriculum? How do you separate that out?
Such a great question. Such a great question. And I don't know if I can nice and cleanly, put part of it over here and part of it over here, right? Here's what design does for problem solving and critical thinking. Here's what EML does for problem solving and critical thinking. Assessment is a squishy, what I call a squishy realm. It's dealing with humans who are complex, who have lots of influences on them day to day. So I think we do our best by saying, here are some indicators that we have. It is perhaps not as clean as running a derivative, but it's still worthwhile for us to know that if we are increasing an intervention in problem solving and critical thinking, that is going to improve curiosity. So I know it's hard sometimes to say, well, how do you know for sure? Well, I guess I'm on the side of I'm in the gray area, but I'm happy to be there.
And in regards to your work, Julia, and this focus on curiosity, could you share with us what impact that's had at Rose-Hulman, either with other faculty or with the way you're approaching your students as you glean more data and actually focus more on the topic?
Sure. So the first use of the data before we were applying it to EML and within our work with Keene was to use it, as I said, with enrollment management, to use it as some differentiator between the student applicants. So when enrollment management is making a decision, they've got students' performance on curiosity index and also another measure called locus of control. Those two things they're using as a way to differentiate between prospective students. Computer science and software engineering are also using it to support interventions in the curriculum. So if they know that their female students are going to need more support for breadth, then they're going to change the curriculum or change the classroom practice to help support that. In terms of what's going to happen with curiosity with regard to EML courses, this summer will be our first sort of big, concerted, large group of faculty working together to develop EML courses. And I'll be there in my role as assessment person to help make sure that those faculty know here is data that is useful for developing the course. We're also going to develop a set of student learning outcomes related to EML so we can measure other aspects of EML within those courses. So it's going to be part of that suite of assessment tools we use in order to measure students and see how they're growing in their EML.
Fantastic. Wow, that's a lot of great questions that came in. I'd like to thank everybody, and as we're winding down our time here, I'd like to just actually give you the floor one last time, Julia, to see if there's any final thoughts or ideas that you'd like to share with our participants before we wrap up the webinar?
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to thank everyone for attending. I know that in any faculty member or administrator's day, there's lots of competition for your time. So I do appreciate you taking time to listen to this and to think about Curiosity Index. I think perhaps the next step for you, if you're interested in partnering, is to drop a line to me at my email address, which is on the webinar site, I believe. And make sure that you connect with me so we can talk about going forward to engage you in the Curiosity Index work. I think it could be very, very interesting for us to ask these questions and to get something measurable, and could be very interesting for future winter meetings and fall meetings. So thanks so much, Steve. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julia. And first of all, really would like to thank you for your time today. I think that was a fantastic presentation, and also a very lively question and answer. As those questions were rolling in, we were asking you, and thanks for answering those on the spot. Next, I'd like to thank all of our participants. Like you said, Julia, I know how tough it is to carve out an hour of time, and it was great to have everybody participate, but also be very engaged, as was shown by the questions that were asked. I'd also like to encourage everyone to share any insights that you gleaned from today's presentation on Twitter using our address @KeenUnleashed. If you could do that for us, that would be fantastic. And I also want to take a second here to promote our next webinar. We have one scheduled for March 24th at noon Eastern Standard Time, hosted by Benson Garner. He will be discussing the value proposition canvas. And actually, Benson also presented at our winter conference, and many of the participants in their follow-up survey mentioned that they plan to implement the canvas right in their courses. So it's a very interesting and useful tool, and would encourage everyone here to not only participate but to tell your fellow faculty about the webinar. And so, and I'm also reminded that you can actually register for that webinar right from your control panel. You should be able to see a link in your chat box, I believe. Just click on that. You can register, get one more thing done before you go on with your day. So with that, Julia, again, thank you very much. Everyone on the webinar, thank you. And until next time, we appreciate your passion for instilling entrepreneurial mindset in our engineering students. Thank you very much.